finally, there are other things that are within the curriculum. I don't want to go through it all right now, but we'd like to launch a research in progress for you as scholars session. We're going to be doing a monthly, article of the month that the leadership team is going to be sending you as sort of, hey, this is something that's really timely. Take a look at this article. And then also finally, we've been developing a pretty extensive reading list for kind of as a resource for you, so that if there are particular topics that you want to dive into, you'll be able to use the reference list. We've started with a list that was developed by fellows at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and we've been adding to that other topics in learning health system science. So just pause there before we turn it over to Peter. Any questions or comments? I just wanted to kind of give you a brief update, let you know there's a lot of action that's happening, and you're about to hear more about that, all those activities over the next few weeks in more detailed ways. Okay. Well, if you have comments or questions on any of that, let me know by email now, or as you begin to see some of these materials come your way, feel free to reach out to me. Again, think of Jeannie and me as always having an open door for you. We're here for you. We email, phone call, text. Feel free to contact us any way you would like. We're eager to hear your input. We're eager to hear about what's going on. Please let us know if there's a particular success that you've had. We'd love to hear about it. We'd love to champion success because I think that helps us understand what's happening with scholars, but also helps, I think, promote you. So back to you, Jeannie, and thanks for the time, and I'll let you and Peter take over from now.
Okay, great, thanks. I just have a couple administrative announcements you can see on the screen. One in terms of the schedule, I think you've all been in contact with Ingrid. She's been helping to the mentorship meetings with the PEDSnet mentor, so thanks for working with her on that. The goal there is to have quarterly meetings. The purpose is really for the mentor to be able to provide, guidance and support around your mentorship team and engagement, as well as your research projects. Just an FYI, we're preparing a small packet for the mentors, and that will just include your original. You all provided some narrative for me for the ARC progress report that I submitted a couple months ago, so that will be shared with them as well. And then lastly, just your network mapping assignment will be in that for them. And if there's anything else that you want to share, you can go ahead and do that. The other schedule item is the in-person meeting. I know there's been a lot of communication on that. We've all tried to engage you to make sure there are no conflicts. That has pushed us out a bit there are a couple possible dates right now in early March, and I just need to get confirmation from faculty that we'll have a couple of our leadership faculty there present. And I think I can also announce that our host institution will be Nemours, which is wonderful. And so we'll be working with them as well. So as soon as we know the final date, I think we gave you via email the possible dates, we'll confirm with you. The last item is just the year 2 subcontracts. I believe they've all been sent out to your administrative teams. I think they're almost all executed, but if you have any questions, you can contact Jill McDonald, who's been the person that's been managing that. Any questions on those items? Okay, with that, I'll hand it over to Peter, and like Chris said, he's going to be really expanding on some of the key concepts Don introduced on our last learning. There's some feedback. Okay, and Chris kind of gave an introduction, but Peter, I want to give you an opportunity to do any personal introductions, kind of, because I don't think we've given you that opportunity before with this group. So anything you want to say on your own background and your research and experience, you can go ahead and do that.
Okay, thanks, Jeannie, and thanks, Chris. And Chris, you're very kind, and whenever anybody introduces you as a national leader, it just means you're old. So
young at heart, young at heart.
And one of the fun things about this is that that there is a group of people who have been thinking about this for a heck of a long time, and we refuse to give up, mostly because there's a lot of work yet to do. and I think a bunch of us went into our careers thinking that we would figure out how to make significant advances in the healthcare delivery system, and then we would be in time for us to be the beneficiaries, and that's only partially true. So, I'm gonna I think I've talked to pretty much to most of the people. So I'm gonna not go further into introductions beyond that. One thing I will say is there are a few of you who have seen pieces of this presentation before, and so I appreciate your patience with that, and also hopefully you'll take the responsibility of thinking about how you're integrating it into the work that you're doing right now. And then one last thing that I'll say is that there's a roving pack of us who talk about many of these issues. Don and John are two of them. Lloyd Provost is another one of our colleagues, and some of what I'll be talking about represents some interactions that we've had over the years. So today, what we wanted to concentrate on is a little bit more about the design and study of complex interventions, because that effectively is what most everybody who's part of this program is doing. I'll use some examples from the approach that we have from some of the work that we've done, and then we can discuss a bit how the frameworks might apply to your own practice. And Jeannie, thank you for putting the slides in PEDSnet template. It was very quick. So go on to the next one. Do you want me to advance the slides, or?
Ingrid will advance. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Don talked about this a little bit last week. In order to use improvement science, one of the starting propositions is to understand and we all understand that the reason to use improvement science is to improve systems. So it's important to have a common definition of a system. And the first two things here, one is a picture which should become familiar to everyone, is Deming's original design or a diagram of what a system looked like. And it was interesting that Deming writes that this diagram was what enabled a conversation that took place over many years in his work in Japan, as he worked with top management and engineers in Japan. And then Don last week talked about the four components of what Deming called profound knowledge, which are appreciation of a system, a theory of building knowledge, which is PDSA cycles, and other forms of learning from variation, and the psychology of change. Go on to the next slide. So there are a number of definitions of a system. I put several of them here. Deming's original one was a little bit general. He talked about interdependent components that work together to accomplish the aim of a system. Russell Aikoff, who I believe was at the University of Pennsylvania, recognized that a system is a constellation of a whole set of parts that can't be divided into independent parts. And then associates in process improvements, Deming's 6 helpers in his last 20 years of his career, Lloyd Provost and Tom Nolan were part of them, modified the definition to emphasize that that the interdependency includes things, people, and processes that work together around a common purpose. So that if you're going to improve anything, the starting, go on to the next slide. There are a few starting propositions. The first is that we should be thinking about work as process, because the main leverage that we've got for changing outcomes is by changing process. Just go on and click through these. A second component I talked about. The third component is that if we work on systems, one of the things we observe, those of us who work on systems, that if you optimize you can work to optimize a piece of the system, but if you do that, the whole system won't work as well. And then also recognizing that people are key parts of systems of organizations, and that Deming really emphasized that people want to have pride in their work. And one of the strong advantages that all of us have when we're working in healthcare is that there's just so much sense of purpose that brings everybody to healthcare. And then all of this resulted in a quote that's attributed to Paul Batalden, that every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the results it gets. So go on to the next one. So again, last week, I think Don started talking about what a definition of quality improvement is. This is a useful definition that comes from the Hastings Center's report that was published in 2004 and it defines quality improvement as systematic data-guided activities designed to bring about immediate positive changes in the delivery of healthcare. And it involves practical problem solving and evidence-based management style, and application of theory-driven science to bring about system change. So go on to the next slide. It's a useful contrast to contrast quality improvement principles or improvement science with clinical research. This is a very broad definition from Harold Varmus, and just pointing out that it encompasses, as we know, everything from translational research to clinical trials to all of the kinds of work that we do, and that it results in treatments that directly improve care. And around here at Cincinnati Children's, there's often a debate that gets stirred up about the difference between this so-called discovery research and clinical research, and it'd be interesting to get people's take on this at some point. But the so-called discovery scientists say that they really are doing blue sky research. It's, they're pursuing ideas to understand fundamental aspects of nature, whereas people who do clinical research are doing research with a purpose. And for us, I think that definitely is the case, that our research should have a purpose. It should result in knowledge that matters to patients and clinicians. So go on to the next slide. So just the first, whoops, now click back, because I didn't want, you were one ahead of me. But so one useful thing just to stop here is to just get your reflections. I don't think you covered this with Don explicitly last week. So just it'd be interesting to have a few reflections on what's similar and what's different about QI and research.
I think QI is often thought to be more iterative in process, although I think research can be as well. But that's one of the things that I think defines QI with the PDSA cycles.
Okay, fast iteration. Yep, great. I know you're not all on mute.
I guess I'm struggling to find the words, right? So in a lot of ways, they feel similar, because I feel like I actively participate in both with the common goal to improve things that I find challenging and frustrating. But I occasionally find myself trying to defend what I do from a QI sphere as research to people sometimes who don't have that same training. So I don't know, you always feel like you're explaining yourself to everybody. Like, I do QI and research, but the QI is maybe not pure enough for the pure QI people, and the research isn't enough research for the researchers. So I'm trying to live in both worlds, as you're kind of, they've always just been the same to me, I guess, in a certain sense. So
I think Chuck hit on a good point where the outcome is the same, right? We're all trying to improve one piece of the healthcare system, and research and QI are just the tools that we can use to get there. Interestingly, I work with a lot of folks that are not physicians, and I think that the second they hear the term research, they kind of get jaded and don't want to work on it. But when they kind of engage with QI, and that's a foray into research, people get more excited about it, because I think there's just a connotation of research involves a lot of investment and time, and quality improvement just has a rapid pace that I think people can get on board with.
Okay, so money, time, pace, anxiety.
I think that in QI, context is considered, a key part, and whereas in some research, I think it can be thought of as more something that you control for, but not kind of a key component of the design.
Peter, this is Chris. I want to throw one out there. I think the money, where the money comes from, and the value proposition that you need to make to get that money, not always, but can differ. So from a research standpoint, we're trying to make the value proposition. Essentially, this argument is being made to other researchers that this is an important problem and that my approach is innovative and I'm going to advance knowledge in some way. And then we publish articles, and that's largely speaking to those researchers. But the money for QI often comes from institutions. And so the value proposition has to be made directly to the institution. And if you're really good, you're making a value proposition and engaging from the get-go the people who are going to be improving the outcomes, the clinicians and the patients themselves. So there's sort of a difference there, and I think it's a little bit what who was it? Was it Anita or Corinna that was talking about the context? But really, where the money comes from, I think, is the key point I want to make.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. All of these, the context, whether context is in the foreground and there's the background, and this idea of where the money comes from, and even how the value that's attributed to where the money comes from is a very interesting attribute. Great. Other thoughts? So now, why don't you go ahead and hit the so I think, who benefits, the analytic strategy, funding source, time frame. The unit of analysis is also one thing that we didn't bring up, but it will come up. When we're doing clinical research, the unit of analysis is often the patient, whereas when we're doing health system redesign, it's usually the site of care. So that also introduces interesting analytic challenges. So let's go on. Thank you for thoughts. Just one other, I'm not going to dwell on this, but one other, it's worth reading this Hastings Center report if you haven't done it, because it makes some useful distinctions that I think, again, as Chuck mentioned, come up all the time in our discussions about the work that we do. And the distinctions between the kinds of decisions that we make when we're making managerial decisions, where we just decide, and there might be innovations that we don't test, where the kind of decisions that get made when we're doing quality improvement, but which really aren't research decisions. And then also the type of research that's going on. Is it research on QI, or is it QI? Is it research? Or is it QI and research? So we can go on to the next one. This is a definition that we developed a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, for what we meant by quality improvement research. And it emphasizes, here the important thing was emphasizing that quality improvement research encompasses design, development, and evaluation, all three of those things. And it usually involves the development of complex interventions that are aimed at redesigning the healthcare system to improve better outcomes. And these are things that we've already talked about. Go on to the next slide. And then one of my good friends and colleagues, a guy named Steve Goodman, who's also a pediatrician, but he's editor of Clinical Trials, and he wrote an interesting article that came out of some interactions that he had at a meeting in the UK. But one of his observation as a trialist was that that there are special intellectual and technical challenges that make it especially hard to do this kind of work because it's focused on how we get evidence into practice and the challenges that result from having systems as the unit of intervention and sometimes analysis. And those challenges are important for both implementation and for evaluation. So go on to the next. So, and here you can click through. So one distinction is thinking of clinical research as answering questions about what works, and there we regard the clinical trial as the most well-developed form of the gold standard of evidence for understanding cause and effect relationships, whereas quality improvement tends to focus on how and being able to predict the results of interventions over a wide range of conditions. That's a lot of the work that we do when we do QI, and I'm going to just really, Don started talking about that last week. I'm going to continue to talk about it this week. Go on to the next slide. Some of the features of the work that we do, as already been noted, is that there's adaptation and modification of the intervention approach using multiple cycles of feedback to address contextual factors. There's a lot of use of measurement over time, and so graphical analysis and quality improvement becomes very important. If we want our work to have an impact, we have to think about sustainability from the beginning. And that drives involvement and engagement of the people who are going to have to live with the changes over time, and also a major focus on reliability. And then the last is an interesting aspect, which is when we're working in complex systems, there's an invitation to use more complex experimental designs, and this is kind of a quest that Don and myself and John and Chris, all of us have, that you all will be able to build systems where you can use more sophisticated designs than that have been the norm, I guess, I would say. Go on to the next slide. So keep going. So my fellowship director was Bob Fletcher at the University of North Carolina, and this is a slide that's out of his textbook on clinical epidemiology that I've always liked, that creates a distinction between what we do when we're designing a research study, often focused on getting a solid head-to-head comparison about two alternatives. And our goal is generalizability. And early on, when I started working with Lloyd Provost, I showed him this design to try and get him to help me understand how he saw quality improvement as being different. And what that led to were the next two slides. The first one, go on to the next slide. The first one was this. Lloyd said to me, look, when you do a study, it's as if you are taking a sample from this environment that you think looks like this placid pond. But the reality is, if you go to the next slide, that you're actually working in an environment that's changing over time, and that the way the environment looks today is not likely to be the way it looks tomorrow. And so what kind of study design do you need to have in order to generalize to a mountain stream, which in this spring might look one way, but in the because there's runoff from the mountains, but in the summer when there's a drought, it's just a trickle of water, because that's more closely representing the systems in which we work. And then go on to the next slide. This idea is embedded in Deming's concept of prediction as the main purpose of and the main standard of evidence for improvement science or quality improvement. It's the ability to predict the results of tests over a wide range of conditions as a means of having a solid belief that we've come up with something that actually works. And that shift from almost that forward-looking shift in how we approach the work actually drives a lot of the experimental and analytic approaches that we use when we're doing improvement science. So go on to the next.
Can I just make a comment? Can you just go back to that?
Please.
Because,
yeah.
I love your talk. It's fantastic. Anyway, but this issue is really, really important, because I think I'll just tell you my own training, both in medicine and then my doctoral training, created a bias against improvement as something that wasn't quite as scientific as research. But if you look at the gold standard for, and that's a terrible bias in medicine that we have to just kind of get rid of. And I think we're slowly whittling away at that. But if you look at that statement, and I read it 3 times while Peter had it up there, satisfactory prediction of the results conducted over a wide range of conditions. The most durable research results do exactly the same thing. That if you can't replicate across a range of conditions, then it really ought to be suspicious of the result. And in many ways, you can get to the same endpoint more quickly by using the QI methods. So, it's this idea of reproducibility over short intervals, engaging the people who matter most, that has led me to believe in the power of improvement to actually generate outcomes more rapidly than research. I just wanted to make that point, because this is really, to me, a beautiful, beautiful quotation that kind of counters the bias that I think is inherent in medicine about improvement versus research.
Thanks, Chris. Do other people have? Yeah, I mean, there's more to say about this coming up, but do others have reactions? I mean, let me keep going on this a little bit more. So there's some interesting language, and there's some interesting ways in which this is discussed in the world of improvement science and engineering and the world of clinical research. And there's also some interesting historical aspects of it that I'll share in a few minutes. So Deming differentiated 2 types of studies. He called them enumerative and analytic. And an enumerative study, the analogy is taking a sample from a pond, whereas an analytic study would be the use of so a sampling from a fixed population might be an example of a enumerative study, whereas an analytic is hit the So in an analytic study, the goal is much more about is using particular designs to get this sort of forward-looking approach. And we won't go into it here, but it's worth some reading about this distinction and how different study designs stack up in the 2 frameworks. What it boils down to is on the next slide. So again, then click through this. I think this is what's interesting is that an underemphasized point in statistics, when we all learn statistics and epidemiology, we all learn this first statement that that the purpose of statistical theory is to describe the validity of a hypothesis for a population that's been studied, but there's no statistical method that provides support for extrapolating the results outside of the population that was studied. And the only way to approach that really is to engage subject matter experts who have some content knowledge and theory to be able to interpret the findings based on their understanding of mechanism to extend the results outside the population. So standard texts on epidemiology and statistics have this term, this description in it, but I personally had many conversations with statisticians who do not say they don't agree with this, and sometimes you have to actually show them textbooks to actually show them this. And for people who are not statisticians, this leads to a reverence of p-values, which again end up being overemphasized in healthcare, and what gets underemphasized is the knowledge, the mechanistic and system knowledge that subject matter experts bring to the work that we're doing. And Chris, you may have another way of saying this.
I can say a lot of different ways. I think the hegemony of the p-value, and to say something that's statistically significant and then and get smug about that, is not only anathema for me and for a growing number of statisticians, but I think actually shows a limited sense of what statistics can do and what it can't do. So what elevates a grant from in the review process is a very carefully constructed theoretical model, or at best, or even a conceptual model, and that's what really makes the best, and then the approach is a way of operationalizing that model and testing that model in reality, because the model is simply a representation of it. So understanding understanding the model and then evaluating the model and then coming up with inferences based on the data that you have is far more important than finding associations that, if you ran them 1,000 times, are unlikely to occur at more than a 95% interval. So I think the p-value, there's a lot written. If you're interested in this, John Ioannidis has written a lot about how the p-value has led to many spurious conclusions in the biomedical research enterprise.
Yeah, hi, this is Don Goldman. I was going to make that. Yeah, I was going to make that very point, Chris, that when we talk to our colleagues in academia, the problem is that there are, in fact, countervailing opinions. Ioannidis clearly states that we're much too generous with our statistical analysis, and therefore we see, as he says, the truth wear off over time, and wants a more stringent p-value criteria for randomized trials, which is what he's talking about. We have to be clear that's what he's talking about. The other thing I think that Peter, you were talking about is the analytic and enumerative language of quality improvement, which when I talk to my academic colleagues is totally frustrating and confusing, because what we do in epidemiology is analytic and enumerative, and we don't use that, I think, obscure language of analytic as described by people in the quality improvement space. So you've got to get comfortable with these terms and know how to be flexible depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. So yeah, thank you to both of you. Go on to the next slide. There we go. Yeah, so I think this is, so what we're talking about is ways to learn, and the key point of this talk is what I'm hoping to do is to help people think about where their work is on the trajectory of development of a particular intervention, so that you're doing the right study at the right time to get to better outcomes as quickly as possible. And so what has happened is that there's been a development of a reverence for this gold standard method of clinical trial, or as the highest form of evidence. And what that overlooks is all the different steps that we have to go through in order to take an intervention idea, develop it to the point that it actually does work predictably for a wide variety of patients in the future. And so Lloyd Provost, in some of his work and with Tom Nolan, identified a variety of different methods that can support learning at different scales of intervention. And they're listed here. I'm just going to focus today on really a couple of these. Then it would be valuable to talk about these in a little bit more detail later. So one key idea in quality improvement is the use of statistical process control charts to learn from so-called special causes. And let me just show you an example of that. Go on to the next slide. So this is an example that came out of some work that Derek Wheeler did at Cincinnati Children's a number of years ago that was actually learning that came out of having a solid QI system in place that was running that allowed us to learn from an unexpected increase in catheter-associated bloodstream infections. If you go to the next slide, and this is really using statistical process control to detect, to create systems that are so-called in control, and so you can learn from them. So what you can see on this slide is, this is a control chart showing catheter-associated bloodstream infections across Cincinnati Children's a number of years back. And in the month of August, in I guess 2010, there was a special cause increase in the number of CLABSIs that was observed. And then if you go to the next slide, there it is. If you go to the next slide, these are control charts from 6 different units in the hospital, like the NICU, the bone marrow and oncology unit, a couple of wards. And what you can see here is that there are no special causes. There, in the month of August, in that same month, there were no special causes, which was kind of interesting. So the first thing that the team did was look to see, was there some place that this was coming from where we could isolate the problem, and they couldn't. So then they did the next thing, which is shown on the next slide, where they looked at, where they stratified rather than looking by unit, they looked by organism. And what they discovered was that in August, so the blue lines are all the causes of infections from January till July, and the orange is August. And what you can see is that there were a lot more Staph aureus that occurred in August. And so this led to more discussions with 2 units. And then if you go to the next slide, what was discovered was that the pharmacy had initiated a new product testing trial of a connector for the administration of oncology drugs. And it was started in August, and they noticed that it was associated with some leaks in September. And they didn't tell anybody in the hospital that they were trying this new method. And essentially, by having real-time SPC charts on all the units, we could detect the change. And then, fortunately, by the time we figured out what was going on, the pharmacy had already just on their own stopped using it. And so what we did was report this to the CDC, because what was interesting, so this is an example of learning from a special cause and actually using that to improve a system. uptick of that magnitude would not have been detectable early on in the quality improvement work because there was just so much noise in the system. But by the time that the work had been running for several years, all the noise had gotten taken out, and so you could actually learn from variations like this. Okay, go on to the next slide.
Before you do, just in the spirit of interaction amongst the faculty, did they, as an epidemiologist, I've seen on a number of occasions where quality improvement programs spend a lot of time examining the system, testing things, talking to people, when a case control study would have solved it within a day or two. Was the case control study done that pointed to this, or was it all just looking at the system and saying, oh my God, we changed something?
Well, if you go to the next slide, what happened was it was this 1 month uptick done. So by the time they figured this out, the next month's data was already better. And the only thing that they didn't do a formal case control study. I mean, I suppose they could have, but it appeared that this was it's a good point. I mean, I guess the question is, do you think they should have done it, given that the system had already gone back?
No, not in this case, but I just remember vividly being asked to look at a extended MRSA outbreak in a neonatal unit in Midwestern Heartland State, where for literally month after month, they were using quality improvement methods to try and figure out why they had so many staph infections. And when we finally did an epidemiologic study, it turned out there was a nurse who was a carrier of staph, clearly associated with the cases, and her treatment removal from patient care for a while terminated it. So quality improvement departments that aren't working with our hospital epidemiologists sometimes don't have that skill set to even know how to do a case control study. So this is why an integrated quality and an epidemiology program is really important.
Yeah, and so I mean, this would be a good example of that, of doing some analytics and then what it turned out to be shoe leather epidemiology to go talk to people about what happened to discover what was taking place. So it's a really interesting example. If you go on to the next one. So this just kind of emphasizes some of the attributes of quality improvement studies. It's because systems are changing over time, the use of graphical analysis enables us to show what the trajectory is, and it also makes it more feasible to predict future performance. And some of that has to do with the way in which SPC charts are used. Go on to the next one. So one of the people one person who I've had the pleasure of interacting with together with Don at the IHI is somebody by the name of John Sturman. Also turns out he was a college classmate of mine, but is most well known for his leadership in the world of systems thinking at MIT. And I think it's useful. I inserted this slide because it's useful. His comments about what the attributes are of a complex system are very useful as we think about doing studies which are complex interventions. So three main things. The first thing about complex systems is that they feature a large number of interacting components, which we've talked about. The second is that together their activity might be nonlinear, and what systems dynamics people mean by that is you can't add up all the individual components and expect to produce the overall impact of what the individual components are. So that's Russell Aycoff's concept. And then the last is that complex systems have a self-organizing attribute of them. So they actually change over time, and we need to have a way of surfacing the change so that we become aware of them. And the last example I just showed was an example of that. In a complex system with lots and lots of different people and things interacting, the introduction of a new device, like the Spiros device, can cause a change. And one of the ways you can learn in systems is by watching basically the way I think of it is just pay attention to what crops up, but do that in a deliberate way. So if you go, just click one more time. There. Yeah, so again, obvious kind of stuff. Systems are constantly changing. The components are tightly coupled. There's feedback loops, and so they're non-linear. There's self-organizing or adaptive. And one of the other interesting features is that there can be time delays. So when you make an intervention, the time delay from when the intervention takes place to when you see an effect might be delayed. So that actually influences what you're learning. So often this often produces sort of counterintuitive results, and they may be resistant to individual policies because it's hard for policymakers to get down to the granular level of what's really going on in order to actually have an impact. Go on to the next. Next, there we go. Let's skip this. So that leads us to how we design the right study. These are R.A. Fisher's principles for designing the right study: have a right objective, do sequential experiments, partition variation, build a degree of belief, that's what we were talking about, and make it easy to execute. And there's an interesting article that Lloyd Provost and Duncan Neuhauser and Lloyd's daughter Shannon just will be appearing in the next couple of months that contrast the work that R.A. Fisher did and the work that Austin Bradford Hill did. Bradford Hill is known for his work on the relationship between smoking and cancer, and probably regarded as one of the first leading medical experimentalists. And historically, Fisher and Bradford Hill knew each other. Bradford Hill was aware of the work that R.A. Fisher was doing and the use of ANOVA and complex multi-factor designs. And Bradford Hill's challenge was to introduce evidence into medicine, and he thought that doctors were not very numerative and they couldn't handle more than one factor. And so he resisted suggesting that we should do multi-factor experiments because he didn't think they would be accepted in medicine. And it was a result of that, and he was an incredibly effective proponent of this idea, and we're still living in the downstream effects of this way of thinking. Go on to the next one. And Don, I'm happy to have you on the phone just to see if I can elicit any responses from you about some of this, or Chris. One of the articles that I shared is an article from the British Medical Journal in the year 2000 from the Medical Research Council that talks about design of complex interventions, and it describes a trajectory of study design from theory development through modeling and exploratory trials to more formal clinical trials and then implementation. And and the article uses the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 terminology that we're used to from clinical research. And personally, I find this a very helpful way of thinking, so that for everybody on the phone who's thinking about projects, it would be useful to understand think about where your project currently is in this trajectory, because that will give you a little bit of a framework of where what you're doing fits into this longer term trajectory that I don't know whether it was Theta or Chuck raised as one of the attributes of quality improvement. But when we're doing research, it's very useful to think about the whole trajectory of work you're doing on a particular problem, because it may take many years to actually work through the trajectory. But knowing where you are on the development is really important in designing the right study, and also resisting the temptation to go too early to a clinical trial.
Peter, a quick comment here. This is Chris. Great figure. I had not seen this figure. So we're going to be challenging all of you to think about the outcomes that your study are focusing on, and what it will take to have that kind of impact, not only at your home institution, which is really important, but at many other institutions, and many similar to yours, and many other populations of children similar to the ones that you're focusing on. Because that to me is what really, you rip everything away about all the jargon. We are all about improving outcomes using a variety of tools, and this is a nice framework for placing your research project and then following a trajectory all the way to systems and patient outcomes.
Thanks. Yeah, the implication here is that before you go to a clinical trial, you need to know a lot, or we need to know a lot about the interventions that we're doing. We need to have the right measures. We need to have the right training. We need to understand how it works in various contexts. And so those are all the things that need to get developed further down to the left. It's really solidifying your theory, your understanding of mechanism of action, that allows you to actually design something that's going to actually have an impact, be durable, and scale.
And Peter, one other quick comment. I've participated in a number of NIH reviews of their clinical trials, and about a third of them, as many as 50%, actually, depending if you want the stratification, fail. Like, they never complete. They don't complete enrollment. They don't meet their targets. They don't generate the knowledge. This is NIH trials, right? Not just clinicaltrials.gov trials. And one of the main reasons why trials fail, protocol complexity is one of them. But another is that the contextual factors that would influence the effectiveness of the intervention are not accounted for in the design of the intervention. And as a result, the interventions fail, or they become too complex to implement. So I just want to point out that this is an issue for RCTs. And what the NIH has done is now it uses a funding mechanism, because it recognizes it's such an important issue. It's called the UH3 funding mechanism, where in the UG3 phase, they may fund 15 different studies to develop the protocols, to develop the regulatory infrastructure, and then to do all of the contextual qualitative work to understand how the intervention would work in different settings. Very, very interesting. And then the studies that do the best job of that preliminary work, which takes about a year, then move on to the actual trial phase. So that you'll see more of this as you start to go through the funding mechanisms. NIH is hot on it. They understand that's a big issue.
It's great. I think, we have, all of us collectively have our work cut out for us to help our, those, often faculty feel like they're being evaluated on, adversely if they're doing these kind of, doing the work that Chris just described. But the reality is that if you don't do that work, you end up with work that doesn't have the impact that you're hoping for. So I just have a couple more slides about this. So if you go to the next one. So the MRC recognized that there were some challenges, and so the second article that we sent is the updated version from, I think, 2008. There are a couple of examples, but you know, the challenges had to do with the fact that the phases were based on the evaluation of drugs. There was some linearity implied by the diagram, and the reality is that there may not be linearity. You may need to cycle back. There was this assumption that clinical trials provide the template for evaluation, which is what we were just talking about, and limited guidance about how to tackle these kinds of problems in or non-health sector interventions, and a lack of attention to context. And so if you go to the next slide, there's another model which there's several diagrams in this subsequent paper. This is one that just recognizes these development, feasibility, evaluation, implementation as an interconnected series of loops that might provide a different way of thinking about the work that you're doing. And then go on to the next slide. Here's a way that we've begun to talk about the iterative nature, recognizing that these various steps are, this is another way of presenting them that just shows that there is iteration. It doesn't show the feedback loops between the different groups. But when we're developing complex interventions, we really like to differentiate these various steps from concept design, which you could imagine as not just a paper, but you know, it might be a video, or it might be a cartoon, or it might be a representation, play act, some room experience that, you know, gives you the idea of what it is that we're trying to put together, to a prototype, to a pilot test, and so on, to actually get to implementation. Again, a whole other lecture about managing a portfolio along this continuum, but something worth thinking about. And then the next, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, thank you. Go on to the next one. I think most of you are aware of Austin Bradford Hill's attributes for establishing causation. Again, we've talked briefly today about degree of belief, or confidence that you have the evidence to be able to predict in the future. These attributes that Bradford Hill described provide a way of getting a sense of how strongly you believe that the interventions that you're developing work. Of course, replicability being, you know, one to pay a heck of a lot of attention to. And then the next slide just addresses why aren't we doing more of this, and why do you all have rich opportunities for career by going into this area? I mean, what you will be learning is how to address a number of these issues, like the fact that we're doing we depend on often the unit of analysis is the site, so we've got to have a system that has multiple sites. We have a reward system that may not be terribly favorable for this, and that requires management of projects across multiple stages of research. Often researchers are doing what I might think of as ad hoc. If you want to have an impact, doing individual ad hoc studies may not be the best way to do that. If you want to have an impact in a particular area, there's got to be linked studies over time. And there need to be clinical laboratories where it's possible to do this. That's the whole idea of developing a set of people who understand how to develop learning health systems. And then I do think that this our lack of clarity about where our research is impedes. It not only impedes publication. One of the most frequent questions I get from when there's a researcher who's developing an intervention is where is it possible to publish this? Because it's not going to be in the New England Journal or even Pediatrics. It's going to be in other kinds of journals that publish early developmental theory development work.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, geez. And I've got Siri talking to me, so I apologize. And then just go to the last slide, which is the summary slide. So key points, first one about statistical testing and its ability to address uncertainty, the value of statistical process control. Yeah, I've touched on the importance of experimental design to enable exploration of mechanisms. And then, you know, the last point is this is very much an evolving field, and one for which my hope is that all of you will, you know, continue to advance this work, because there's a lot of work yet to be done. So I'll stop there. I don't know whether people have questions or comments or reactions.
I would just comment, this is Erica, on the what you said about the need for clinical laboratories where care can be redesigned. I just thought that was a really interesting way of looking at clinical care and learning health systems, and not something that I think we often think about. So.
Yeah, there's the dissemination, and Don for years has been egging me to go to the dissemination and implementation conference, and this year I'm going. And one of the panel talks is going to be on what they call natural labs. And so really the work that you guys have your work cut out for you. It's to create the so-called clinical laboratory, and that means actually engaging with everybody. That when you start to think about what really making that happen, it becomes obvious that we have to have entirely different relationships with our colleagues about the fact that, yeah, we are going to be doing some experiments and we are going to be fixing operations. And, you know, that's just plain hard.
Can I ask a question about these phases that the need that this has to be sequential? Because when you're talking about these labs, and I think about my own field, and there's so much work going on from so many different sectors towards outcomes improvement, and I guess I see it more as a connection of and recognition of who is contributing to what phase in order to merge it together and put it within the system. Like, it's not a single researcher necessarily who's the person who is having to go through phase 1, phase 2. So, because it seems insurmountable. Like, one thing is, like, you know, as we're trying to learn into our system and not realizing that we actually have the capacity of all these people around us to connect in order to understand or increase that degree of the belief that this intervention may actually occur.
Yeah, so Theda, I'm not too, you're asking, one, where does a researcher fit into a clinical care setting where you're trying to do research? And that seems like that's one comment. The other comment is, and there's a lot of work to do to figure it all out. So how do you reconcile those two things?
No, I think I'm not delineating like your definition of a researcher might be different from my definition of a researcher. I think that when we're looking at these phases, as you described, you know, the theory and the modeling and the trials and then building, there seems to be a time series in order to reach the outcomes that we want to get to this kind of this grail of long-term implementation of a reliable intervention within a moving system for outcomes improvement. And I think that I don't know if I see it as you have to approach step 1 before step 2 before step 3,
oh, yeah.
Right? As opposed to we have to take stock of what is going on in each of these phases in the existing system, and work on recognizing what elements of this, you know, what's going on in modeling and what's going on in trialing, what's going on in RCTs already existing can help create that ultimate I mean, I think the goal is still the outcome in a moving system, right? So that's so I think that to me, it's more of a connection than it is a time series.
Yeah, no, and that's why the MRC, your point is why I think the MRC may have decided that they wanted to change the model to something that didn't present it as a linear sequence and recognize that different pieces of work might be informing where you're going. At the same time, I think your other comment is if we're part of if we recognize that we're part of a complex system, again, Deming would say that the role of management, that systems have a greater chance of hitting their purpose if there's actual leadership and management. So somebody's got to have the whole system in mind and where you're going in order to make those interconnections work. And one of the challenges that I see is that in our academic medical centers, we don't do a very good job of connecting what the researchers are doing with what the clinicians are doing so that they're complementary. And just to give you a practical example, in our division at the Anderson Center, right now, one of the big areas of focus is patient-reported outcomes. And we have one of my colleagues who's on the operations side is leading a project is responsible for I think we have about 450 PROs in daily deployment at Cincinnati Children's across 30 divisions. That's one of my colleagues. And if you talk to her, she's just trying to get them used reliably. Some divisions use them well, some divisions don't. Some of them are informing care, other divisions want to use them for research. I've got another colleague who's her partner, who's a researcher, and her goal is to get to continuous care. So continuous PROs, so collecting data between visits to inform the decisions that clinicians make, even if don't see the patient in front of them. And there's a massive amount of work, research work, that has to do with what's the right technical platform, how to redesign workflow, how do we get this integrated into Epic, how do we deal with the training that needs to happen for patients, all the contextual factors. And there's often friction between the two of them because they're trying to figure out how to bring these two things together. So those are the kind of real life practical. They have absolutely the same goal. It's just that the operations person isn't ready for a researcher to be doing research in her system where she can't even get daily PROs developed, and the researcher wants to get in between visit PROs. So how to reconcile those two things becomes a practical challenge.
I also want to point out that's really nice interchange, that the metaphor, that linear metaphor is kind of inconsistent with the learning system model. If you just look at that title slide, the PEDSnet logo is a continuous learning cycle, and then you can make it three-dimensional with time. The key here for you as learning health systems scholars is to apply the right tools to get to better outcomes. So at times you're gonna enter the cycle in a scale-up model. You know that things have that the improvement methods have led to change, and you're going to use the science of implementation to scale up. And once you scale up, then you're going to have new questions about how to make outcomes even better. And then you might then slide into more of a research design mode. So you can enter the cycle at any point, I should say, but you're bringing to bear the tools of improvement, implementation, and research in order to improve outcomes. And then you as scholars should be skilled in all areas so that you can apply the right tool at the right time.
Other thoughts or reactions?
I have one more I want to ask if
Keep going.
It's about the if there's information out there about when we talk about replicability, is there a way that we can distinguish between context-specific factors that can, like, I don't know what's out there in terms of being able to say, you know, if we're trying to bring this across different sites as an example or different locations, is there a way to discern what's absolutely necessary as the bare minimum of the intervention versus the what we can build within a context that actually is flexible?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's the kind of answer that we don't. I think it's an attribute. Actually, if you look at the PCORI methodology standards for complex interventions, that now I'm blocking his name.
Peter, I just sent those out to everybody.
Oh, well, I'm just blocking. Brian Mitten, I think, provided a lot of leadership for that. But one of the features of these kinds of interventions that we work on is that they often don't have, you know, real big effect sizes, and the effect size depends on the context. And so that your comment is an invitation to more complex experimental design to start to tease out what works in what settings and what are the most important factors. Because if you want to get something to scale and actually stick and have an impact, you need to answer exactly those kinds of questions.
You know, we're going to have one of our sessions is going to be focused on complex interventions, approaching it from kind of a research perspective. We're going to do a case study on a recently funded trial. It's funded by PCORI, and take a look at the standards I sent out to you for complex interventions, because you'll see a lot of writing in those standards that echoes exactly what Peter said. But one of the requirements that PCORI has is if you're going to study a complex intervention, that you also embed within your protocol a process evaluation. Not only do you have to have the model that lays out how various contextual factors may influence the outcomes, you actually then need to measure the implementation, and that will vary across sites. So I think that's an important difference from, say, medication A versus placebo B, where you wouldn't need a process evaluation necessarily. And in fact, that study that you'll hear more about is one of the requirements for its funding was that the investigator team adds a process evaluation.
What do folks have questions there left? Was this, just let me ask, is this stuff that you've been exposed to previously and it's old hat, or do we need to do more of this?
Parts of it were familiar, but there are other parts that were really helpful, like that figure, to figure out where in the phase we are. So complex interventions was something new to me, so I appreciate that that was shared, because now I think for us to just take a deeper dive in how to use that is going to be helpful.
Thanks, Anita.
I agree. I really appreciated the articles about complex interventions, and I think it fits so well with many of our settings and what we're trying to do.
One of the things that we're focused on a lot in the work around here is trying to get better measures of reliability of interventions when we do them. And so that leads to probably three things. One, probably four things. One, better specification of the interventions, getting them extremely clear so that when we're doing an intervention, it's almost like a checklist. Somebody who's doing it actually knows that they've done it. A second, that actually influences the measurement of the intervention. And then a third thing that we're doing is, as we're thinking about scale up from the beginning, and so we're starting to use logic, stuff that you learn in public health school, stuff like logic models, to really try and understand all the different steps that you have to go through at the beginning to actually get where you're going. And a lot of this work is very Don emphasized it last week in his talk around key driver diagrams. A lot of this sort of theory development and explicitness about program design and development is stuff that we tend to skirt over. And I'm, again, personally, in the work that we're doing here, multiple investigators and multiple teams, we're just finding that it's painful to do that, but it's also it's turning out to be helpful at the front end.
Many of you, if not all of you, will be interested to see what the ratio and proportion is. We'll be writing a K08 or a K23 following your tenure in the K12/PEDSnet Scholars Program. And one of the ways to think about your independent K award would be to do the work we're talking about today as the work of your K award. In other words, to use qualitative methods to understand the contextual factors that may influence the intervention, to actually develop the intervention and pre-test it, and with the notion that, and maybe even then examine a similar intervention in existing data to get some of those skill sets. But the point I'm making is that your independent K award could serve as the time in which you really flesh out everything that we're talking about before you actually run the intervention. And that, to me, I've supervised a number of independent K awards. That's been a very successful method. And then from a learning health systems perspective, not only thinking about the intervention in a study perspective, but also what it would take to then implement that intervention at the point of care and then scaling it up across multiple care sites. All of that could be really great substrate for an independent K award.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well.
With that, I would like to say, thank you, Peter. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
And, Peter, just to remind everybody, Peter is on our leadership team, so is Don Goldman, so is John Finkelstein. So you're getting a dose of the leadership team here early in the video conference series. But please do feel free to reach out to Peter. Maybe, Jeannie, you can share Peter's email if you have any questions or comments about what he's discussed today. Next up is John Finkelstein. We've already given you a prelude to that. Again, thank you, Peter, for putting together such a well thought through presentation.
Okay, thanks everybody, and seriously, just let's use the network to discuss issues that are relevant.
Yeah, great.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.